Slowly, very slowly, like two unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right, north, northeast, east, southeast, south, south-southwest, then paused, and after a few seconds turned unhurriedly back towards the left, south-southwest, south-southeast, east. This is the tragic ending to Brave New World, when John discovers that before the might of the world state, he is powerless, so powerless that he is unable even to opt out from society. And so the only way out is death, and he hangs himself. It's a sobering and poignant moment that brilliantly hammers home the powerlessness of the individual before the state and society. Brave New World is one of those brilliant novels that has much to say about society and is often heralded as being profoundly prophetic in a variety of ways. It has a considerable reputation. So obviously there's a heck of a lot that one could say about it. But in this video, I want to focus on the final chapter. I will return to Brave New World in the future, but for now, we're going to stick with the ending. And with that said, let's have a look at a brief overview of the events of the final chapter before we discuss it. The final chapter picks up after Bernard, Helmholtz, and John have had their conversation with Mustafa Mont, one of the 10 world controllers. Bernard apologizes to John and Helmholtz for trying to sell them out to save his own skin. And Bernard and Helmholtz depart for the Falklands, their place of exile. As they say farewell to John, John reveals that he wanted to go with them, but that Mustafa Mont denied this so that he could go on with the experiment. John, however, says that he will be damned if he will allow himself to be experimented with and leaves the city to live in isolation, since he has, in his words, eaten civilization and it has defiled him. He has no desire whatsoever to live alone in a society that revolts him. He sets up his hermitage in an abandoned lighthouse and intends to live in solitude. Unfortunately for John, 3 Delta Minuses happen to see him engaging in a spot of self-flagellation in part of his attempt to cleanse himself from the contamination of civilization and atone for his participation in it. The Delta Minuses are fascinated, and they spread the word. As a result, John is pestered by a journalist, who John summarily assaults by delivering a prodigious kick to the rear end of the unfortunate reporter. Rather than discourage further visitors, however, this encourages a great deal of further interest. This is entertainment to them. And after Darwin Bonaparte captures footage of John beating himself sometime later, John is then made into a movie and, well, a feelie, and then confronted by a vast number of people at once, all wanting to be entertained by him. There are too many people for John to intimidate, and they know it. But once Lenina arrives on the scene, desperately hoping to win John over, she is still besotted with him. John loses control and attacks her, crying out, "Kill it! Kill it! Kill it!"
Who wants it? Who wants it? I'll have some.
The rest of the crowd joins in the chant, since they are programmed in a way to participate in group activities, shall we say. As the chant continues, it transitions into the orgy-porgy chant. Soma begins to flow, and what ends up happening is an orgy of atonement starts spontaneously out there in the countryside, lasting through the evening, into the night, and until the early hours of the next morning. When John awakes, he realizes that he, despite his revulsion of society and its practices, has participated in it. His psyche fractures, shatters. There is not enough mustard or self-whipping in the world that he can engage in to undo what has been done and purify himself. Totally demoralized, completely shattered, John hangs himself in the lighthouse. Very little in Brave New World shows the power of the state and the powerlessness of the individual, quite like the resolution of the novel. There are several examples of this that I would like to point out. Firstly, Bernard and Helmholtz are to be exiled to the Falklands. Now, Mustafa Mond says that this is more of a reward than a punishment for them, because they will be surrounded by the most interesting people in the world, and I'd like to add, they'll be unconstrained by the demands of the world state's orthodoxy. However, the fact that they have no say in the matter is a clear indication of the power of the state and the powerlessness of the individual. And I think this is really nicely summed up when Bernard becomes almost hysterical and Mustafa Mond has guards drag him away, not to be beaten, but to be put in a sort of soma coma, intoxicated by pleasure, so that he can calm down because he's an inconvenience, after which he'll be shipped off to the Falklands. The state is all-powerful. Secondly, the power of the state and the powerlessness of the individual is also seen in John not being allowed to join them like he wants to, simply because of a fleeting interest or whim of Mustafa Mond. This is particularly distressing to John because he realizes that he is being treated as an object. If one were to invoke Immanuel Kant, you could say that he was not being treated as an end, but as a means. John is also particularly upset and distressed by this because he has come to loathe the society of the world state, and so remaining there brings a great deal of torment to him, since he has to stay by himself, surrounded by the society that he loathes, stripped of all the people he cares about and connects with. Linda is dead. John and Bernard, off to the Falklands. This is something that should be quite unnerving for us when we think about it carefully, because it shows the callous nature of the world state's authorities. Sure, they aren't beating anybody or destroying them physically and killing them. Sure, they aren't destroying them psychologically and threatening them with a gulag or something of that nature. But the world state is still pretty callous here. And I would say that this is something that I would look to extend as a commentary on the nature of ruling powers, whether they be governments or leaders of organizations. Very often, the good of, or the desires of the individual are subordinated to the demands of the organization or its leaders. Now, I'm not suggesting that every person should simply be allowed to do whatever the hell they want all the time. I am not a radical libertarian by any stretch. There are clearly things that an individual might want to do that are damaging to society and others, and being in a position of power or leadership means that one has to balance the good or the interests of the individual against the good of the collective or the interests of the organization or organism. A simple example, a silly example, I guess, but it demonstrates the point, is that of theft. One might want to take something for oneself without paying for it, but if that were allowed by the authorities, it causes severe problems for society and for other individuals. This, by the way, is the subject of much writing in political philosophy and theory. All the same, though, a worrying and disconcerting experience that most of us have had at some point is to be treated like we simply do not matter when considered against the so-called good of the machine. And I think this is especially true because we tend to have the suspicion that when a leader claims something is for the good of society, or whatever the organization is, it may just be that it fits his or her ideas or whims rather than being for the actual good of others or society. And this is very much something that we see in this particular chapter. Mustafa Mond prevents John from doing what he wants basically because of a whim. And I think it's disconcerting for us because we identify that this is the kind of thing that we see happen in society around us, and it's probably something that has happened to you. It's certainly something that's happened to me. Furthermore, as we see with Mustafa Mond, it's very easy for leaders and rulers at whatever scale to think that they have the right to do as they please, or that the organization is theirs in some way. Mustafa Mond certainly seems to consider the society of the world state as his personal fiefdom in which he can do whatever he wants. He can conduct experiments. He can make the rules. He can break the rules. In fact, he does that. He's the one with contraband in his safe, books that nobody else is allowed access to because nobody else could handle it. And so this interaction with Mustafa Mont by John, this set of circumstances, does reveal something about the nature of reality, like all good literature does. A third way that the power of the state and the powerlessness of the individual is shown, and perhaps worst of all, is in the way that John attempts to flee society, only to find that he cannot flee society and is powerless to do so. Again, I think all of this is supposed to be a sobering reminder that the individual has very little power indeed in the face of the large organizations in which they find themselves, be it political or private. If you have had anything to do with a large government department or the customer service department in your local bank, you'll get the sense that it doesn't really matter how reasonable your request is or how reasonable your query is. If the system doesn't give the option to the person to whom you're speaking, assuming you can speak to a person at all, you will never get what you're looking for. You may as well throw yourself against a cliff repeatedly until it is too painful to go on. And I must say that I do find it disturbingly amusing, I guess, that in Brave New World, a lot of the people there, because they are basically NPCs, are very much like the AI chatbots that you talk to in customer service departments. If it goes against their programming, they can't give an answer. They just parrot platitudes to you. Anyway, this is disconcerting because we are, or at least I was, continually fed the idea that we can each stand up and make a difference and triumph over the insurmountable odds that face us. I grew up with films like The Matrix, Equilibrium, and The Hunger Games, to name a few, in which an individual, usually part of a small group, was able to overcome insurmountable odds to reshape society for the better. At the time, this was inspiring, but the more I read novels like The Handmaid's Tale, 1984, Animal Farm, Brave New World, and so on, where there are no happy endings and the boot of power, hard or soft, crushes the individual, and the more I experienced reality, the more I began to see the awful plight of the individual who often exists at the mercy of the machine and the petty tyrants who are slaves to the machine, and actually rather bloody like it, to be honest. Now, does that mean we should just allow ourselves to be crushed by the system? Well, I don't think so. I don't think that's the point of the novel, and that's certainly not what I think. But we should be aware of the reality of our individual powerlessness and the power of the state and the machine. And I think the novel does a great job of showing this. And in doing so, it is a warning. You don't want to allow your government, your leaders, to get to the point where they wield this kind of power and regard themselves as sort of petty Mustafa Monts who can do what they want because the organization is theirs. It's a warning. And that brings me on to a related point. In Brave New World, it's not that the government oppresses the people with an iron fist. Rather, the population is genetically engineered, conditioned or brainwashed, drugged with soma, and so obsessed with leisure that they are actually pretty happy with the status quo. In Brave New World, society is complicit in the situation, and John, Helmholtz, and Bernard are victims not just of the state, but of society itself. Before society, perhaps even more than the state, they are powerless. And in fact, it's probably a good idea to conduct a brief line of inquiry that questions how the world state gets to be the world state without, at least to a certain point, the people, society itself, buying into the whole program in the first place. And beyond that, it's the collection of cogs, the faceless NPCs, who eventually finish off John. They might not kill him directly, but he is almost absorbed by them like some sort of predatory amoeba. Or, put differently, as if he is possessed by the mob. And that's a whole other discussion we could have, but not for today. In any case, Society itself is an incredibly powerful force. It is able to overcome John's determined set of ideals and absorb him, and it is completely impervious to his attempts to resist them. It's John who is corrupted by society. He is not able to corrupt them. Look at what John says to Helmholtz and Bernard. "I say," Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously, "you do look ill, John." "Have you eaten something that didn't agree with you?" asked Bernard. The savage nodded. "I ate Civilization." "What?" "It poisoned me. I was defiled. And then," he added in a lower tone, "I ate my own wickedness." There's a rather profound idea that is found in that exchange. On the one hand, John understands that there is something wrong with society, and that by being amongst it, he is corrupted and defiled by it. Most fully seen when he participates in the orgy of atonement, willingly, at the end of the chapter. Society can be a threat that can corrupt a person. On the other hand, he also acknowledges his own wickedness and propensity to err morally. And it raises a few questions for us to ponder. How do we resist the corruption of society? And how on earth can we tell whether society is in the wrong or whether we're in the wrong when we find ourselves at odds with it? They're serious questions, and they're ones that we have to pose to ourselves continuously. Before we bring this to a close, I'd be remiss if we didn't look at one more thing that is related to all of this. It's the lighthouse. I'd like us just to appreciate the brilliance of the decision to make John withdraw to an abandoned lighthouse. A lighthouse is a beacon of light. They warn ships away from hazards and are meant to prevent disaster, shipwrecks. But the lighthouse in Brave New World is abandoned. There's no light, no warning light, no guiding light for the society of the world state. It's gone. It's been snuffed out, abandoned by people long before. Remember what I mentioned earlier about society potentially being complicit? I think this is part of that. There is no lighthouse for the society of the world state. Religion, Christianity, has been consumed and digested to become a tool of the state. Its words are changed, its original teachings perverse and taboo. In fact, impossible for the people of the world state to understand. Its rituals have been transformed into hedonistic, drug-fueled orgies. And, for goodness sake, St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the most prominent religious sites in London, is now the site of the fortnightly solidarity orgies, where the language and trappings of the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, which points to the central doctrine of Christianity, the atonement, are subsumed and twisted into the form of an orgy. The press is housed, ironically in the extreme, in the same monstrous building on Fleet Street as the College of Emotional Engineering and the Bureau of Propaganda. On a side note, I think there's a subtle hint here of what the press is always a half step away of becoming, a tool of propaganda and manipulation, and we have seen enough of that in recent times. Government is not elected, nor can one move from one caste to another. Everything about a person is determined before hatching, and there are, of course, no families. Finally, there is no thought or reflection. Literature and history is banned. History is bunk, after all. All the elements and institutions of society that might provide some sort of guidance or warning against what society has become or is becoming are gone. And at some point in the past history of the world state, they had to be destroyed, twisted, corrupted. The result? There is no guiding light, no warning light even, save the guiding light of Mustafa Mont and the New Orthodoxy. And so, society in Brave New World has no ability to change course, and is completely blind to their own position. It's a sobering warning to its readers of what happens when the institutions and elements of society are altered and eroded. And it's a reminder of the responsibility that those institutions and elements have to guide and protect society. After all, in the world of Brave New World, this transition had to happen somehow, which ultimately people let happen. And so the point is that we should be wary of eroding too many of the parts of society that we take for granted. While change is not necessarily bad, it's not necessarily good either. So we should be careful about what we do with our societies. As we go about messing with things, change is inevitable, of course, but as we go about messing with things, we should be very careful that we're not messing with it in a way that's going to be detrimental in the long term. Remember, just because somebody says that the purpose of a thing is whatever they claim it to be, doesn't mean that that is what the effect will be. Our history is littered with people saying we're trying to achieve one thing and often genuinely meaning it. But the things that they do lead to something completely different. In any case, this is the warning of Brave New World. Once society is corrupted like this, there is no hope. And, in my opinion, only the ruin of civilization. That's why John's feet rotate around the points of the compass without stopping at the end. In the same way that there is no rest for him, no place for him to go, there is no guiding point to which society can turn. There is no moral direction. It is all a spinning compass at the end. Civilization, like John, is dead with its guiding light snuffed out. Brave New World's closing brilliantly brings us to the point where we have to consider individual powerlessness before the state and society, and the vulnerability of the individual before the collective and the state. Brave New World's closing brings us to the point where we have to consider the nature of power and the relationship between the state and society, as well as how society is often complicit in the systems it complains about so much. Brave New World's closing also raises the question about how the balance between the individual and the system should be struck. And I think all of these are very serious topics that we have to think about, even if we never find ourselves in a position where we can effect meaningful change. It's up to all of us to carefully consider the world around us and look for the danger points. Anyway, enough of this for today. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much for listening. This channel is going to look at literature predominantly, and it's going to involve me exploring various novels and dramas that I've read and interact with the ideas that are present there. I hope you come along for the ride.